by hand. I'm going to show you how to solve them on your calculator. It has a quadratic equation solver. Then I'm going to show you the square root property, and then a technique called completing the square. One of the few times when on the test I specifically say you have to solve this problem using this, okay? Because this technique of solving quadratic equations, the technique itself is used in other places, for not solving, okay? So even though your calculator will solve them, it's the technique I need to see. And at the end, I'm going to show you side by side the quadratic formula and what's called completing the square. Okay? So that was our preview. So first of all, zero product property. Zero product property means if you're multiplying things together, they give you an answer of 0. Somebody in there had to be 0. So this is how you solve quadratic equations that can factor. So most of your life is spent simplifying and getting it set equal to 0, and then you have to factor. So in this case, to solve this first one, here, I would distribute the x. So I'd have 2x squared plus x equals 15. I would move the 15 over to the other side because my goal is to have this equal to 0. So I have 2x squared plus x minus 15 equal to 0. Now here I check to see if it's factorable, or I use the quadratic formula. You don't actually have to factor. Usually the quadratic formula is a bit heavy duty if it factors. Mostly it's easier to factor. But if you suck at factoring, you know, what can I tell you? Maybe it's time to break out the quadratic formula. So let's see, that'd be plus 3 minus 5. So 6x minus 5x gives me 1x. So now I set each of these equal to 0. And then I solve these little baby linear equations. Okay, so my final answer, I've got 2 answers for that equation. And as with any equation, you can always check and make sure that they work. You know, equations are your best friend on tests, especially multiple choice tests. That means you know exactly what the answer has to be ahead of time before you even go through all the drama. But you still have to show me some work. A little bit of work. I can also, because I have a calculator that I know. Once I get that thing set equal to 0 and in the right order, my Casio will actually give me those 2 numbers. Which is perfectly fine with me, because I'm assuming every person in this room could do that factoring. No matter if that's a fantasy of mine or not, you don't need to tell me. You certainly don't need to show me you can't do it by trying it and failing. Okay? But the key is you have to get it to that point where you have 2x squared plus x minus 15 equals 0. So there could be a mess of stuff to do before then to clear it up. Get rid of parentheses, move stuff around. You could always make a mistake there. If, for example, when you move the 15 over, you didn't put a minus sign, you put a plus sign, your Casio is going to give you the correct answer to what you wrote, but that's still wrong because you made the mistake earlier than that. Okay? Now, you don't actually have to have a trinomial for this to work. All you have to have is a squared term. So this one, when I put the 8x over here, this is a different kind of factoring. I see sometimes students forget about there are easier kinds of factoring. This is not necessarily 2 parentheses and you're just put. This is a much more primitive kind of factoring where you just have something in common. Both of them contain an 8 and an x. So I take that out and I have 3x minus 1. So either 8x equals 0, so x is 0, or 3x minus 1 equals 0. 3x equals 1, x equals 1, 0. And again, I can go from here to here by Casio. Because I'm not testing you on factoring. We've tested you to death. If you can't factor by now, you need to start making it, okay? So, how do they do that? Well, here are all the instructions, okay? So don't freak out as I'm doing this. They're all written down when they're in the notes. there's even a little place where you can go and look at a video that will show you how to do this too. Okay? But basically, here's what you want to do. I'm going to leave this up so I can do these two problems. So I go to mode, and on mode, you have a lot of different things that you can do. This is where we also went last time to change to complex numbers. Now we want equation, EQN. So I'm going to tab number 5. And then I have a list of different equations this calculator will solve. This first one with the x and the y in it, that's systems of equations. That's like 2x plus 3y equals 4, 5x minus 7y equals 10. 2 equations, 2 unknowns. This one is 3 equations, 3 unknowns. That one is a quadratic, the classic quadratic form that you would use the quadratic formula with. ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So I just hit number 3. What we get is a little grid. It's actually a matrix, but we don't have to use that word yet, okay? That I am going to put in the numbers in front. Now notice that it has to be in that order. In other words, a is 1, x squared, that's first, b is in front of x, and c is the last one. So you have to have it here first. You have to get to this point. You can't input that equation. So once I get to here, then I have my A, B, and C. So I could say something like right here, I could say A equals 2, B equals 1, C equals negative 15. That's what you would do, write down if you were going to do the quadratic formula, or that's what you type into your Casio. So I have 2, I hit 2, and then you just have to hit the equal sign at the bottom, and it pops up in there, and then it moves the box over to the next place where you're going to have a value. So now the next one I have is 1, because there's no number for the x, so it's 1x. And then the last thing I have is a constant, which is negative 15. So negative 15, so left off the negative sign. And I hit equals. So now all the numbers are in there, so now you just keep hitting equals. So I hit equals again, and there's the first answer, and equals again, and there's the second answer. No more factors. Now I have a share of income like this. So, what would you have to show me on the test? Well, you could show me this, 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 and the answer. In other words, just show me what you're going to put into the calculator. Now, you could actually do this even if you have, for some unknown reason to me, some POS, Texas Instruments calculator that you're still clinging to. And by the way, you'll never get out of this thing again unless you go back to your screen. So you've got to go back to mode and go back to complex. Get back to the original screen. In other words, you keep hitting clear or this and that, and you're locked into that equation screen until you get back out. If you're going to use it on any calculator, then what you would want to use is a quadratic formula. So then you'd use this. So I still wouldn't actually have to see some work, because you could do that substitution just by typing it on your screen. In other words, you don't have to write it first by hand. Even if you have a Texas Instruments, you would say, okay, I'm going to have negative a b, so negative 1, I'll do plus the square root of b squared, so it's 1 squared, minus 4 times c times, or a times c, c, all over 2 times a. So all that can be typed in. There's one of them. And if I wanted the other one, I would go back and edit this. Oh my gosh, it's just gonna mess with me. There's the other one. So any calculator you can use a quadratic formula on to get these answers. So why do all that? then all you have to do is go to the equations. So let me go through this one more time. So here's my equation. So that's going to go into my formula. So the first thing I figure out is A is in front of the x squared, B is in front of the x, and in this case C is 0, because there is no term, right? There's no constant here.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's mode equation. Number 3 is quadratic. So A is 24 equals, B is -8 equals, C is 0 equals. There's my first solution. There's my second solution. So we should have no fear of quadratics. And I don't have to see factoring. Or any of that stuff. What I have to see is what the algebra is. The algebra of the problem is getting this all together on the same side. That's the algebra moves. Simplifying, cleaning it up, moving stuff around. That will be sure. So like I said, here's the button you hit. This is what the screen looks like. You pick equations, and then you pick number 3. Okay? So you're going to go here. And I give you a place to go and watch that being done. Okay, so there are other ways of solving quadratic equations. One of them is called the square root property, which is fast, and it's going to be part of completing the square, so that's what I'm showing it to you first. So let's say I have something like 3x squared equals 12. I can solve it the first way I did it. The first way would be to do 3x squared minus 12 equals 0. Factor out the common 3. Realize you've got the difference of squares. Factor that. And then get your 2 solutions. Right? But a much easier way to do this is to take advantage of the fact that there's only one x term. In other words, the reason I have trouble solving quadratic equations is they have both an x squared and an x. 2 different kinds of things that I can't put together. But this one is just like, has a single x in it. So I can isolate that x. In other words, I can say 3x squared equals 12. Divide both sides by 3. So it's x squared equals 4. And then whenever you have a square, you can solve it by taking plus or minus the square root. Plus or minus the square root of the other side. So this will give me x equals plus or minus 2. So it's almost like solving a linear equation. So excuse me, that's the square root property. Isolate the squared term, push everything to the other side, take plus or minus the square root, that's it. So x squared plus 25, that's x squared equals negative 25, x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 25, that's x equals plus or minus 5, 5. But remember, once you get it to here, once you go from this to this, that square root, it could be something nasty. You can evaluate it on your calculator. Go back to mode and complex. I did the square root of negative 25. It'll also tell you 5i. Okay, so just in case it's something weird that you don't want to actually simplify yourself, you can just use your calculator to tell you. Because that, if you've been told repeatedly, does not factor. X squared plus 25 is the sum of squares. You would have to factor it with complex numbers. So this you would have to use a quadratic formula. Now, it turns out that it's not just that you have to have an x squared. You can have anything squared as long as that's the only place there's an x. So this one's a little bigger, but it still has a square, which means I can still solve this by saying whatever is inside equals plus or minus the square root of this. So that's x equals -7 plus or minus the square root of 8. And that would have to be simplified. What's your calculator? Now your calculator does not have a plus or minus key, so when I'm simplifying something like this, I just write it with a plus. If that doesn't simplify, if there's nothing else to do, that answer is going to come back. If it simplifies, the calculator will fit. So this is x equals -7 plus or minus 2 square root of 2. Which you should recognize is the kind of thing you get using the quadratic formula. Could I do this on my Casio? Could it do it? Yeah. But it's actually longer than this. Now, this one, you could just type it in. You know, type in A is 1, because that's the x squared, B is 0, because there is no x term, C is 25. But this one, I would have to do a lot of work to get it into that ax squared plus bx plus c form. I would have to take this and FOIL it. Get x squared plus 7x plus 7x plus 49. The 8 over here. So x squared plus 14x plus 41 equals 0. And then I would have to put that into my Casio. So I would go mode, equation, number 3, 1x squared, 14x, 41c. First solution. Second solution. Try that one, too. We'll give you answers with radicals. Okay? But that's more work. It's faster to do it the other way. So if you only have a single squared term, this technique of just taking plus or minus the square root is easier. Plus, excuse me, as a technique, we're going to use it over and over again, okay, throughout this course. So you have to learn how to do it. Okay, so completing the square. Lots and lots of moving. So before I force you to read all this, let's just look at one, okay? Because reading the steps before you do the problem is like reading the manual before you want to hook up like the DVR. You know what I'm saying? I don't want to start there because it's just going to make me crazy. So first, I'm just going to try stuff. So, here's what I'm trying to create. I am trying to create a problem that looks like this one. Something squared equals a number. That's what I want to be. That's what I want here to create. And once I get that made, then I can do this. So first thing, I would like the number by itself. So I'm going to start by writing x squared minus 18x equals -5. So here's how I'm going to create that thing over here. What I want over here is a perfect square. So I want something so that when I write 2 sets of parentheses, it'll factor into a nice perfect square. So I have to put a number in here to make that happen, to make this a trinomial that will factor. And here's how you do it. You take half the middle number, and then you square it, and you add it to both sides. So I'm going to go plus 81, plus 81. So, why am I doing that? Because over here, I now have 2 numbers that multiply to 81 and add to 18. That's 9 and 9. this thing over here factors now. And over here, I have whatever the hell that would be if I wasn't taking NyQuil. 81 minus 1, 76. So I have x minus 9 squared equals 76. So this is like part 1. I get the square. Square equals number. Okay? And this technique is always the same. Half the middle term, then you square it, and then you add that number to both sides. It's always going to give you a perfect square. Whatever you have here is always going to be what's in parentheses there. So that's what I'm telling you. The lead has to be 1. I'm going to show you in that. Variables to the left, constant to the right. Half the x term, square it, add it to both sides, and write your perfect square. So part 2 is to now take your perfect square and finish it like I did up top. So that means write x minus 9 equals plus or minus the square root of 76, so x equals 9, plus or minus the square root of 76, so x equals, calculator, not 9 plus the square root of 76, 9 plus or minus 2 squared to 19. Now, this is way longer. Oh, sorry. That's way longer than typing it in, because I could type that into my calculator right out the gate. I don't have to move anything, I don't have to do anything. I can type that directly in the calculator, and I should see that. What that tells you is on a test, you have to know the correct answer. That does not mean you get any credit for the just showing me the correct answer. You got a calculator. I know that. I forced you to get it. Okay? You get 0 points for that. The whole thing I'm giving you the points for is the technique itself. Showing me the steps. You know, taking half the number, squaring it, adding it to both sides, factoring it so you get your perfect square, then finishing the problem. The steps are the important part. Obviously, we could just get the number if that's all we wanted. But like I said, this particular technique is used in other places. We're going to use it in graphing. Okay. Also a bad word, I know. Okay, so here we go. You could, yes, sir.
That's only when you ask specifically for the final square.
Yes, there's one question. In fact, it's after you get over the first page is all the I stuff. First question on the second page says, solve by completing the square. That's the only place on the test you have to show me this technique. I mean, there are a ton of these kinds of equations on the test where you could use it if you want to, you could use something else. But there's one that you have to show me how to do this technique. Is that a stretch or a question? Okay. Okay, so you can put this in right from the get-go and know exactly what you're supposed to do.
What's that one called? What we're doing in the house?
Completing the square. This right here. So I can go to mode, pick my equation, pick number 3. These are nice. I don't have to move anything around. I'm not going to screw up anything, you know, when I'm trying to simplify. I got 2 for my x squared. I got minus 4 in front of my x. I got minus 3 at the end. So I'm looking at 2 plus the square root of 10 over 2. 2 plus or minus the square root of 10 over 2. So that's what I'm expecting to see. So let's make sure I see that. Okay. So So off we go. First thing is, the difference between this one and the one above it, this one has a 2 in front of the x squared. This technique only works if it's a clean x squared. So I have to start slightly differently. I have to start by dividing everyone by 2. God help us. I'm going to have fractions in here, okay? I know how you react to that. Don't laugh, I know you're crying on the inside. Okay. Remember, you have a calculator. It doesn't matter what the numbers are. You have no fear of fractions, no fear of decimals. It doesn't matter, they're just numbers, okay? So second step is the pure number by itself over on the right. The x's over here. So now I'm going to go over to the side and do my little thing. So I take half, half, the middle term, and then I square it, and I add it to both sides. So on this side, that's x minus 1, x minus 1. So it's x minus 1 squared. Over here, I have 3 halves plus 1. I realize that would ask you to find a common denominator. Luckily, you have a machine that will do that for you. So once again, it doesn't matter if that's 15 19s plus 23 17s. What do you care? Completely irrelevant how bad the numbers is. You got to get over this idea you have in your head that, oh, that problem's hard. Yeah.
How do you get x times square?
That's what that factors to. Okay, multiply to 1 and 2. It's always going to factor with this number right here. So let's get back to my screen. And let's do 3 halves plus 1 plus 5 halves. Okay. So now I got it to the point where I'm ready to start doing the plus or minus part. I'll go over here. So x minus 1 squared equals 5 halves. So this means I'm going to have x minus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 5 halves. So that's x equals 1 plus or minus the square root of 5 halves. And you're looking at that and thinking, okay, that doesn't look like anything like what you got when you did it with your calculator. Well, that's because it hasn't been simplified. Luckily for you, if you have a Casio, all you have to do is type that in. If you don't have a Casio, then I'm going to take you through hell. But let's watch the Casio do it first. So you know you can't leave that. You can't leave a radical in the denominator of a fraction and all that kind of crap. So I'm going to type 1 plus the square root, fraction underneath, 5 over 2. Ta-da! Why haven't you bought this one? Yes.
At the beginning, you said you had to get rid of the coefficient.
Yes.
But I did it both ways, away from without the coefficient. I got the same answer.
What'd you do with the 2?
I like put it into the. Well,
Oh, if you put it into that, yes, you don't have to get rid of it. That takes it. To use the technique of completing the square, you have to do it. No, you leave it in. When you're just going to type in the equation, you just type it in. It's this whole technique of taking half the middle and squaring it. It has to be gone. So you do not have to go through and simplify this. You can just type that mess into your calculator and then tell me equals 2 plus or minus square root of 10. Like that. However, for those of you who still don't have a Casio, you would have to do something like this. You have to say 1 plus or minus. This is square root of 5 over square root of 2. I would have to rationalize the denominator by multiplying on the top and bottom by the square root of 2. That will give me 1 plus or minus square root of 10 over square root of 4. That will be 1 plus or minus square root of 10 over 2. Now I have to get a common denominator between those. So I have to change 1 to 2 over 2 plus or minus the square root of 10 over 2. So that would be 2 plus or minus square root of 10 over 2. Which is why, when you get your test, you'll see at the top a name, a place for your name, and right next to it, a place that says calculator. Because if you're going to tell me, well, I like my TI-30X Texas Instruments that I've had since 4th grade, okay, then this is what I'm going to have to see on the test. Because that calculator will not change things over. So you ain't doing that in your head. Okay? If you've got a Casio, this is all I need. Keep that in mind, depending on the calculator you have, I have more work. See, to me, it's a waste of time. That's arithmetic. What do we need to spend our time doing that? So, here's the big thing. Once again, first part, getting it into that square form. Second part, getting rid of the square and getting the final answer. And I need to see all this crap. Well, not this part, but the part of the box. Because that's completing the square. Okay. And another one here. We're ready?
Well, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
In punching it into the calculator,
Yes.
it didn't come up with a plus or minus.
No, it comes up with 2 separate answers.
Okay.
It comes up first with a plus and then with a minus.
Okay.
In other words, you'll get an x1 and an x2.
Okay.
It can't write the stacked plus or minus symbol.
Okay.
That's a shorthand symbol that we math people use because we're lazy and we don't write them as separate. But once you hit equals the first time, you hit equals again, and the next one will come up. They're both there. Okay. So here we go. So no matter what I'm going to do, everybody needs to start by being over on the same side. I could be factoring, I could be using the quadratic formula, I could be putting it into my Casio, I could be completing the square, but I need that look of a quadratic, that ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So I'm going to make this 3x squared minus 2x minus 4 equals 0. Okay, that classic quadratic look. Now from here on out, I have all different sorts of ways I can do it. Maybe it's factorable. Maybe I want to use a quadratic formula. Maybe I'm going to use completing the square. If I tell you you have to use completing the square, that's what you have to do. But if this particular problem is elsewhere on the test, it's up to you, whatever technique you like. So I'm going to continue showing you completing the square. So same deal. You need a clean x squared. So everybody needs to get divided by 3. So I'll have x squared minus 2/3 x minus 4/3 equals 0. I am going to put 4/3 on the other side. No freaking. Okay. And I am going to take half of the middle term. And then I'm going to square it. And I'm going to add it to both sides. And at no time do I cry because they're fractions. At no time do I say, oh, wait, how did you do that? I am not going to tell you. First of all, you learned it in 5th grade. Second of all, if you forgot, get out your calculator and type that in. Your calculator is going to do it. You should never, ever, when it comes to the numeric part of this, be sitting there thinking, how am I going to do it? If you don't see it instantly, then you should be limbering up your fingers, okay, for the magic to happen. That's all you have to remember. Don't be intimidated by the numbers. The numbers can get freaky weird, okay? So what about the factoring? Well, remember what I told you. This is what's always going to be in parentheses. So this thing is going to factor x minus 1/3 squared equals 4/3 plus 1/9. Let's see, I don't know what the hell that is. Mis cercas, almost. I knew that. I just tested. Yes, sir.
I think like after you said about the 1/3 part, that it'll always be.
That is always this.
So before you square it, that's always gonna be.
That's what's gonna come out in there. See? Minus 9? Minus 1? Minus 1? That number. Because, and you can do it back in your head. 1/3 squared, there's your 1/9. 1/3 plus 1/3, there's your 2/3. Okay? You're just not used to factoring with fractions, so it looks weird. And quit freaking out. You're all looking at me like I just kicked your dog. It's just a fraction, for Christ's sake. It's not radioactive. It won't hurt you. Okay. So I got to the square part. I survived that long. Now I have to go to the square root part where I get the actual x by itself. So once again, it's going to be x minus 1/3 plus or minus the square root of 13/9. I put the number on the other side. And don't worry about what I've got there with the square root yet. I'll think about that later. Those are the same steps every time. Plus or minus the square root, move the number across to join it. If you don't see what's going to happen here, type it into your Casio. Okay. Type in fraction 1/3. I actually wrote 1/3 plus, again, I can't type the plus or minus, so I always just use a plus. Plus square root, fraction template, 13/9. There we go. So this is going to be 1 plus or minus the square root of 13. Great. Now this one is actually, I consider, easier than the one above it, because simplifying this is ridiculously easy, because that you can take the square root of. So that whole bit on this one above, where in order to do it by hand, I had to rationalize, put it together, do this, get a compound. I don't have to do all that. Because when I take the square root of 9, I'm just going to get the damn 3. There's the square root of 9. That's 13/3. And then I just put them together as one fraction. So it's easier. Okay. Uglier to begin with because of all those fractions. So when students say things to me like, well, what's the easier problem? I don't know. I think this one's easier if, you don't have to mess with that crap at the end. This one above had nicer numbers to add and subtract. But truthfully, I consider these totally equivalent because the only thing that's changing is the arithmetic. And we are beyond arithmetic. We are at a higher level. We're in college out. It's a big time out. Okay, so that's, yes.
One question, so sorry. The arrow, is that pointing at the answer of the whole question? And the black letters, that's how to check it?
No, that's if you had to do it by hand. You were just going to type it into your Casio.
Okay.
If you're not going to type it in your calculator, you separate those. I take the square root of 9, gives me a 3. I realize 3 is my common denominator, so I can just put them together.
Okay.
As opposed to this one from hell, where I have this. Once I separate them, I realize I have to rationalize the denominator. Rationalize it, get that. I have to create a common denominator, and then I put them together.
So in all of our answers, we're always going to have plus over subtraction, plus over minus in this type? Okay.
Well, the ones you're going to have on the test, yes.
Okay.
Not in the universe. But you always have a plus or minus, but it doesn't necessarily look like that. Okay. If you're doing a quadratic, there's two answers. Potentially. Okay. So, there's a quadratic formula. So, in general, you now basically have three techniques. Type it into your Casio. Move on with your life. Use the quadratic formula, which is typing numbers into a formula. Or use the technique of completing the square, which is a series of steps. They all should lead you to the same place. No matter what, I would start this problem the same way. I would start it with multiplying by the 2x. I'll bring the 7 across. That thing doesn't factor. I usually check that first. Doesn't factor. So now I'm ready to start working. If I had a Casio and I was taking a test, I would start by typing that into my Casio. If that thing factors, it's going to give you nice answers like 1/2 and 5. If it doesn't factor, it's going to give you creepy answers like 6 plus or minus squared 7 over 5. You know what I'm saying? So you know immediately whether or not it's going to factor. Okay. So I'm going to show you the quadratic formula. So that means I'm going to use this puppy. So the thing about using the quadratic formula, I like to break it down into 3 pieces. There's what's underneath here, the b squared minus 4ac. So I'm going to do this. A is 2, b is negative 6, c is 7. Let's do b squared minus 4ac first. So that's negative 6 squared, 4ac. This right here is very important. It's not negative 6 squared, it's the whole thing, the negative side and the 6 being squared, which means that's going to make it positive. If you type this down here, if you type negative 6 and square it, you get negative 36. If you type parentheses, negative 6 and square it, you get positive 36. So if you input this into your calculator the wrong way, without putting those parentheses around it, you get 2 different answers. You may not believe me, but you should believe your Casio. That square sitting on the number only touches the number, not the minus sign to the front. If you want the entire thing, the minus and the 6, being squared, you have to put in parentheses. So I'm showing you this because if you have a TI or something, this is what you would be typing in. Okay? So I can type this in, negative 6 squared minus 4 times 2 times 7. You could also use multiplication symbols, I'm just using parentheses. And I get negative 20. Okay. So, here's what I have now. I have x is equal to the negative of b. Okay, so that's negative of negative 6 and positive 6. Okay. So there's a sign change right here. Plus or minus the square root of negative 20 all over 2 times a. So 2 times 2 is 4. And then I would have to simplify that. If you have a Casio, you type that thing into your Casio, and it will simplify it for you. If you have a TI, you have to do it by hand. This will be 6 plus or minus square root of 4, square root of 5, square root of negative 1, square root of 4. That will be 6 plus or minus 2i square root of 5 over 4. Factor out a 2, would be 3 plus or minus I square root of 5 over 4. Cancel. Oh, the hits keep coming. That would be 3 plus or minus I square root of 5 over 2. And if you're told to write it a plus bi form, you would have to separate those into two pieces. Everything I've done that you're seeing on the screen right now, you don't do with a Casio, if you just type. Yes, sir.
I want to ask you something about,
What's that? It's a quadratic formula. I haven't done that yet. This is just, all I'm doing, this piece right here is just to tell me what to put underneath. In other words, you can write it as one big, giant square root with all that crap underneath, but I find that looks really confusing. You know, it's better to get that and just write it down. In other words, you have three things going on. You're gonna change the sign on B. You're gonna simplify all the stuff under the square root. And you're gonna go 2 times A on the bottom. Those are the 3 pieces that you're gonna put together. Or not. Sitting right there waiting for you. This would be where you go if you were right here. This would go right into your casket. Right from there. You can't do the first line, but you can do the second line. So if you actually just needed the answer, your Casio, you type that in, and it'll spit back that. Right? Yes?
For the exam, if you have a question like that just says solve the quadratic equation, the only word that you would want to see is just put it in the...
I want to see this, what you're going to put in,
Yeah.
and the ABCs.
Okay.
Then, as long as I know that you understand what you're doing, you understand you have to get it equal 0, you know what A, B, and C are, then you're going to use your process. You're either going to use your Casio or you're going to use a quadratic formula. Either one could have that sign. Yes?
So if we didn't put up the 2 answers, what would be wrong?
Well, it's a multiple choice test, so you just have to see what it looks like on the multiple choice. I believe online they usually ask it for A plus BI form. Okay, so that's why I'm showing you, because that's one of those things that can screw you up again online, because if you write it as one big fraction, it's not going to take it. It wants 2 separate pieces. Now, I can do the same thing by completing the square. One last piece to show you. Start by dividing everybody by 2. X squared minus 3x. 7 halves equals 0. Put the 7 halves on the other side. Take half of -3. That's -3 halves. Square it. And add it to both sides. So, what goes in the parentheses? It's this. Go here. Always. And then I add those two. Right in my head, for God's sake. Minus 7 plus 9/4. Take plus or minus the square root. Put the 3 halves on the other side. Okay, type that in. I'll have 3 3 halves plus or minus.
You need to specify on the test whether you wanna use, want to use it in a specific way.
One time.
Formula.
There's one problem. The first problem that you start to solve, the first equation says, solve by doing this way. And then there's like 13 more that say,
Give me your
solve.
email address. I'll send you
I mean, we're gonna spend the rest of our time here solving equations. You know what I'm saying? So